Today it is October 14th and we will be discussing the situation on Verbove's northern flank. We'll look at Avdiivka and lastly at the situation on the Oskil riverfront, looking at Makiivka and the forested area around Liman Perishi respectively. Let's begin by looking at Verbove's northern flank. I'm mentioning this specific part of the Orikhiv sector because in other parts of this front we have not seen any changes since my last video, so I basically gave a pretty good rundown of what's going on in that region in yesterday's video. But let's look at what's going on to the north of Verbove, an area that, as you can see on the fortification map, at least based on satellite imagery, appears to have less defenses than in the areas directly to the west of Verbove where main Ukrainian assaults were occurring. So for a while I was wondering, why weren't the Ukrainians trying to achieve a breakthrough and try a pincer move on Verbove from the north, given the fact that it seems like this area is less fortified? Well, I think now we have some answers based on a series of footage that was released. And what you can see in this footage is that in recent days, the Ukrainians have sent several small groups towards the line of contact on Verbove's northern flank. And what they were able to do is they entered this Russian trench over here. Before doing that, elements of Ukraine's 15th Karadag National Guard Brigade, they shelled the Russian mines that are just to the east and to the west of the tree line that I was just marking in blue. In this piece of footage linked over here, you can see that the 15th Brigade, they shelled a concentration of TM62 anti-tank mines that were placed in this area most likely in order to prevent a Ukrainian armored advance. So by shelling it, it seems like they were paving the way for their infantry and for their vehicles alike. And you could see that it makes sense because there were several paths over here that those vehicles could take. And in videos that I will show, you could see in the background that there are some destroyed vehicles, which could be from other operations or it could be from the Russian side. But either way, it does show that there are vehicle engagements in this region at some point. And what you also see a bit further to the south in this video or this photo from the Russian side, from their thermal imagery, is that the areas in between those two sets of parallel red lines, you see the high concentration of landmines that were scattered by the Russian forces. And that's a huge reason why the Ukrainians have, first of all, not tried as much to advance over here. And when they have, it has been difficult. It's because of the high amount of landmines, which cause a lot of destruction for their forces. So if we zoom in, we'll see here that you have this Ukrainian squad, which includes several men, and they are able to infiltrate towards the Russian trench, which was set up in order to defend against Ukrainian attacks. They were able to storm it, which indicates this area is a gray zone. And once they do, obviously they do this at night in this specific region. You could see that they're using the thermal imagery, the Russian side. They have a drone that has a thermal camera, and that's how they're able to spot the Ukrainian forces in the first place. The artillery of the 7th Guards Air Assault Division is notified of this, and you can see how once they are spotted, the Ukrainian forces are shelled upon. I'll move the video a bit further so you can see that. You can see that there are strikes on the Ukrainian positions over here, and eventually the attacks are repelled. And this is just a microcosm of what we're seeing more generally on this part of the front line, and an explanation for why the Ukrainians have not been able to advance around here. We're going to spend some time looking at the situation on Avdiivka. Although there have not been many changes to the front lines, I do want to go more into detail and look at some of the footage related to the Russian assaults. First thing that I'm going to note is that the amount of Russian forces that are engaged in these attacks is much larger than we've seen in other similar Russian attacks. And what I mean by this is that there is a contrast between the Russian attacks on the flanks of Avdiivka that we're seeing, especially on the north, but also to the south to a lesser extent. And this is much different than some of the Russian positional attacks that we've seen go on over the past year or so on many different parts of the front line. We saw it in early 2023 in Zaporozhye. We saw some of it on the Donetsk front as well throughout all of 2023. But those were positional advances using platoon size or smaller forces in those operations. And what we're seeing specifically from these assaults by the Russians is, first of all, they've amassed hundreds of different units of equipment for this attack. They've also amassed a large amount of forces, multiple different brigades, multiple different units that we're going to go through. The main Russian composition in this region includes a lot of DPR units. The DPR units are mainly stationed just to the north of Donetsk city, which makes sense as Donetsk is the capital of the oblast of Donetsk. And so there is an emphasis on protecting it. You could see here Somali Battalion, 1st Avdiivka Brigade, you have the Spirne Battalion. These are just some of the DPR units of the 1st Army Corps that's been integrated into the Russian army that have been around since 2014, really. And then you also see some territorial Russian motorized rifle regiments that I have marked over here. They don't even have logos because they're newly formed units that there is very scant information about. And these units, they are new, they are less equipped, they're poorly trained in comparison to other Russian units. And these are the ones that have been recorded in some of these instances, conducting some of the attacks along the Avdiivka sector. And at the very least, we know that they have a strong presence over here. So I'm just gonna go through some of them that you can see I'm clicking on. And then if you go a bit to the north, you also have some territorial DPR units, similar to how the Russians have their own territorial defense force. Of course, there are also elements of Russia's regular army, and there are some instances of other Russian units like the 9th Separate Marine Brigade, not regiment, and you do have 2 Russian artillery brigades stationed in this region. The one that I see here is the 238th Artillery Brigade, so they're supposed to provide the support, and they were a big part of Russia's preparation on the early morning of October 10th before the Russian columns started their attacks. Based on the estimates for the size of different Russian units, and based on the presence of these units along the Avdiivka front, I was able to estimate that the number of Russian men, generally, I don't want to say they're fighting on the front line because they're not all fighting on the front line, but a lot of them are on the rear as well. Some probably around Donetsk and some of them around these positions over here, just to the west of Makiivka. Either way, based on the units that I've marked in the sector where I have the red lines running, it's between 25,000 to 55,000. So I know that's a very large range. That's because the estimates for the size of Russian brigades are very large. And I would say that it's closer to the 25,000 number. It's probably very close to that number, actually. But either way, that is still a large concentration of forces, and a lot of them have been moved in more recently, given the fact that a lot of them are territorial forces that were recently created. So it does indicate that the Russians do plan on using a large pool of manpower in these assaults, and there's also a large concentration of firepower, which does explain why the Russians, first of all, were able to advance. There's other reasons. First of all, that the Ukrainians, they were caught by surprise, you could say. You could also say that the Russian firepower at the beginning was too much for the Ukrainians. So in their forward positions, they were overwhelmed and were forced to pull back. In some instances, up to 2 kilometers, in other instances, a couple hundred meters. We're going to start off with the northern flank of Avdiivka, and we'll go through some of the footage over here. So before the Russian attacks, the main Russian positions were within Krasnohorivka, and the fields that were just to the west of it were considered a gray zone. You had the concentration of up to a dozen or maybe more different tanks, BMPs, MTLBs within each individual column, and multiple of these different columns, which within them have sometimes dozen amount of units of vehicles. They advanced in multiple different directions, with the 2 main directions being in the direction of the slag heap to the southwest, and then directly to the west towards the rail line. If we're looking first at the area around the slag heap, here is this visual, so you could get a first-person view of the situation from a drone. You could see this is the body of water that you saw on the map a second ago. You could see the village of Krasnohorivka on the horizon. So the Russians, they were advancing from the horizon towards your first-person view. So you can see it's a lot of it is flat. A lot of it is actually on lower elevation. Some of these places are open fields. There's a few routes that the Russians use that I'm going to highlight in a second. But the Russians mainly relied on local roads. Sometimes they went on open fields when it was necessary. The reason they wouldn't want to use open fields as much is because the Ukrainians have put a large amount of landmines in this region, just as the Russians did north of Verbove, and also just because of the swampy terrain, which is becoming an issue in this region. It's a larger and more pertinent issue in northern Ukraine, including Luhansk and Donetsk, than it is in Zaporozhye and Kherson at the moment, just because of different temperatures in the climate. But yeah, that's part of why. And you could see that they started over here, the Russian columns, they advanced like this. And I suppose the goal was to reach this direction and then dismount the infantry and take over the slag heap. You could see that the Ukrainians from the 110th Mechanized Brigade, because that's the defending force in this region, they were able to counter that. They were able to target the Russian forces with artillery strikes. Here's a video from Deep State showing some of that, and you can see some of the tanks that were hit in the process, which as a result caused the crews and some of the forces that were within the BMPs to leave their vehicles. But what I will say is that we now have confirmation that at least at a certain point, the Russians were able to reach the slag heap, at least one of them, and this was done on foot. So I'm going to move on to this marker over here. I don't have the video shown, but you could click on the link. You could see that 110th Mechanized Brigade, they released a photo of a Russian soldier who was killed on the slag heap. And this is in line with a lot of reports that we saw coming from the Russian side, where they claimed initially that the Russian forces, at least infantry, were able to make it to the slag heap, but that following a fierce Ukrainian counterattack and heavy battles, they were pushed back. And at the very least, the Russians have failed to secure it. There is some nuance. For instance, from Rybar, they report that there are still battles going on around the slag heap, so it is contested. But either way, you could see the level of Ukrainian resistance has led to some Russian personnel casualties, and then much more in terms of actual casualties for the vehicles that we're seeing a lot of in videos. And again, to look at Avdiivka southern flank, the Russians were able to advance in the initial days. We could use a ruler to see the extent of their gains, at most 2 kilometers through some of these open fields. But again, there's the same issue with going through those open fields because of the landmines in this region. And also, the Russians were unable to get control or even enter the village of Verbove, and a bit to the north, they were not able to reach Tonenke. And this is a failure, you could say, because they were sending a lot of vehicles in this direction, large columns, not as large as the ones on the northern flank, but it would be the easiest to take over these villages on day one of the attacks versus a couple of days later when you already have the Ukrainians that are prepared in this region, that are already beginning to launch counter-battery fire. On day one, when the initial attacks began, the Russians reported that the Ukrainians were conducting a troop rotation. So that would be the best time to strike. And nonetheless, they were not able to take over these key positions, which would change the situation because the Russians would be in control of some key villages that are extremely close to the supply lines that the Ukrainians are utilizing to conduct rotations and to send additional equipment to the 2,000 men located within Avdiivka. A big reason for the lack of Russian gains in this region so far is the fierce defense put up by not the 56th, but the 53rd Mechanized Brigade, which I've located somewhere over here on the map. But anyway, what you'll see is that as the Russian columns that were initially responsible for attacking northwards were withdrawing back to their original positions, which were congregated around Pisky, which is a pretty small settlement, but it is a suburb of Donetsk that was fought over last year during the summer. So this seems like a coordination point for the Russian attacks in this region. So you had several Russian BMPs that started off in Vodyane and made their way back to the village of Pisky. At the same time, the 53rd Mechanized Brigade, they began hitting those 4 different vehicles in this case. They actually hit 4 of them with FPV drones, which I'll show you guys over here, so you get an idea of how the Ukrainians are not just using artillery, but they're also utilizing FPVs in this region. It's something we saw less of before the attacks, but it seems like some of these brigades have been giving this equipment now in order to find different ways to diversify their attacks on Russian vehicles. Additionally, Ukrainian FPVs, they are hitting Russian positions in trenches that the Russians just captured recently over the past 4 days of fighting in the region over here. I made a minor change to the map, which indicates that the Russians have control of the areas adjacent to this road. There are some trenches in this area that the Russians were able to take over, which will be a springboard to either clearing out the mine shaft just to the west, which is a major Ukrainian fortification, or to begin entering the southern outskirts of Avdiivka. And moving a bit to the east, there's a video here which shows the Russians shelling Ukrainian positions in a filtration plant, which indicates the Ukrainians do still have control of some areas to the east of this specific highway. I really don't want to make definitive statements as to the losses that both sides incurred in these attacks, but I will be honest that I have not seen any unified number of Ukrainian equipment losses. I'm sure that they did suffer heavier personnel losses just due to the fact they're defending in some of these regions and were prepared. And as a result, they've been forced to move in some of the reserves from the region just to create reinforcements. At the very least, we know that they moved in the 129th at some point to fight in this region. But in terms of the Russian side, because they're on the attack and they are utilizing large armored columns, then it is expected that a lot of those vehicles within those columns will be damaged, especially a lot of those BMPs and a lot of those armored personnel carriers. In terms of estimates that I've seen from the Ukrainian side, and I want to say Ukrainian side, but also there's a lot of video evidence to back this up. I can't verify myself, so that's why I'm going to say Ukrainian claims. What they're saying is that at the very least 45 units of equipment, specifically vehicles in this case, were lost. So when you count losses, that's different from destroyed. Losses could mean that a vehicle was abandoned, that it was partially damaged, that it was like demobilized, anything of the sorts. And in some cases, those are retrievable. But I've also seen certain estimates from the Ukrainians that exceed 45, some of them actually going above 70. And it is certainly possible when you have dozens of different columns that are advancing towards an area of the front line that is so fortified with so many landmines, with Ukrainian artillery in the region and fortified positions with firing points, ATGMs, all of that. It does make sense based on the footage that I've shown you guys and that is linked on my map. And there are some pretty heavy casualties to Russian vehicles. There may be also Ukrainian vehicles that I've linked on the map that have suffered damage, but you're seeing more so of the Ukrainian defense that's dug in, so you're not seeing as many vehicles being utilized. And we're going to have to see the full extent of these losses as time goes on, so I don't want to give a definitive statement, but it is similar to the way in which the Russians attacked last year in the direction of Vuhledar in November, and there were also a large amount of casualties for in terms of vehicle losses for the Russian forces that were attacking on the flanks of that heavily fortified city that's also in the Donbass. Around Bakhmut, we have a slight correction to the map. I now have an indication that Ukraine has full control over the village of Khromove. You can see that I have this strip of land because Khromove is basically just one specific road going in one direction. And it appears I have control of it based off of footage that I have shown over here of the 6th Motor Rifle Division of the Russian forces shelling Ukrainian positions in Khromove. You could see that some of the houses over here are still standing and could be used as forward positions. Others are actually reduced to their skeleton, and you could see that the Russians are engaging with those positions. Khromove itself is very fortified, and the area just to the north of it on Khromove's northern flank, located over here, is even more fortified with a lot of trenches. Some of these trenches were captured by Russia initially once they were conducting offensive activities on Bakhmut's northern flank earlier in the year during the Bakhmut offensive, but eventually the Ukrainians were able to push them back out, and I'm sure that they've now turned these fortifications into something more expansive that could be used to protect against Russian attacks in the future. In Spirne, I made a minor change to the map based off of geolocated footage from Russia's 123rd Motor Rifle Brigade. Here you could see some of the strikes on Ukrainian positions, and this is from October of this year. No specific day attached, but you could see generally that there are Ukrainian dugouts in the open fields to the east of Spirne. There were trenches over here, and they are pretty extensive. You could see that the Russian artillery strikes on this region are pretty significant, though it's all a part of the positional warfare that's going on within this village, and it's also explanation as to why the Russians have been able to advance in this region, and also vice versa, because of just how fortified it is and because of the focus that we're seeing on places elsewhere. So as a result, I was able to adjust the map a little bit to give Ukraine control of this field just to the east of Spirne. We also know that the Ukrainians have fortifications to the west of Spirne and also to the west of Avdiivka. Some of their most significant fortifications are built in this box over here. The commander of Ukrainian ground forces, Alexander Syrsky, reported that there were Russian offensive activities today in the direction of Makiivka using armored vehicles, and you can see that based on the changes to the front line, the Russians have been able to make some very minor advances in the fields just to the east of Makiivka. This is a part of Russia's broader plans for offensive activities on the entire Oskil riverfront, but in terms of a more localized goal, it would be to push back all of the Ukrainian forces across the Zherebets River, which is a very narrow river, which the Ukrainians have crossed in multiple different regions. Their strongest point across this river is located a bit to the south around Torske, but so there's another region just to the east of Makiivka, and Nevske, which the Russians have been trying for a while now to clear out, and now we're seeing an effort at doing that. And lastly, today we received reports from both sides indicating that the Russians have amped up their attacks on the village of Synkivka, not directly, but in the general direction of that village, generally in the forested areas to the north of that village and just to the east of it in the open fields. Here, what you'll see is I have a video of the 25th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade. In this unit, they are attacking the different Ukrainian positions. Most likely, there are DRG units operating within these forests, so I do consider it a gray zone. And you can see that the Russians are shelling these positions of the Ukrainians that are just to the south of Liman Pershi. The geolocation for this video is over here and it's over here. So the second geolocation where I'm showing the box is pretty close to a train station that Russia took over that is just to the west of Liman Pershi. So you can see that the Russians are still actively engaging Ukrainian forces within the forest to the north of Kupyansk. And that is a big part of why the Russians have been unable to advance over here. Whenever they make some notable gains in the forested area or in roads within that forest or in fields to the east of that forest, like over here, the Ukrainians are able to reverse those gains by sending in their own DRGs and disrupting the Russian forward lines and eventually, over a very long period of time, gradually pushing them back. So what we've seen is that based on this geolocated footage, I've had to adjust the map and show that the Russian positions are about 1 or 2 kilometers more than what they were previously imagined. And you could see that the Ukrainians do have full control of Synkivka, despite the fact that there have been numerous Russian assaults in this region. There have been numerous reports by the Russian side that they've been able to at least enter or capture this settlement. I do believe that in August there was a serious attempt at capturing the settlement and that they were close and that they were able to flank it from the east at least, but that eventually the Ukrainians were able to push them back. And even now that Russia is resuming these attacks, we could see based on the footage that the Ukrainians were able in their last effort to make some reversals to the front line. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.